Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your money still exists, but your permission to use it doesn't. Your balance is there. The numbers haven't changed. But when you try to spend it, a message appears. Transaction not approved. Not because of fraud, not because of insufficient funds, but because the system decided this purchase is not allowed. Most people think financial control looks like confiscation. Police, raids, frozen vaults, dramatic headlines. But history shows something very different. Real control rarely arrives with force. It arrives with design, with rules, with infrastructure, with systems that feel helpful, until they become inescapable. And for the first time in monetary history, governments and central banks are openly building a form of money that can be programmed. Transaction by transaction, rule by rule, behavior by behavior. Not theoretical, not conspiracy, documented, published, tested. To understand how dangerous programmable money really is, you have to understand one simple historical truth. Every time rulers gained fine-grained control over how money could be used, personal freedom shrank, even if people didn't notice at first. Money was not always neutral. In ancient Rome, emperors didn't just tax, they manipulated the money itself. Beginning in the 3rd century AD, emperors like Caracalla and later Gallienus reduced the silver content of coins while forcing citizens to accept them at full value. This wasn't just inflation, it was behavioral control. Soldiers and bureaucrats were paid in debased coins, but taxes were often demanded in higher value currency or goods. The state decided what kind of money counted, and when. People couldn't opt out easily. Refusal meant punishment. Trade narrowed. Local economies broke. The currency still worked, but only inside rules imposed from above. Fast forward to medieval China under the Song dynasty. This is where paper money first emerged at scale around the 11th century. At first, it was a convenience innovation. Merchants didn't want to transport heavy metal coins. The government standardized paper notes to support trade. Efficient, modern, helpful. Then came overissuance. By the 12th century, the state printed more notes than reserves could support. Inflation surged, and eventually, the government restricted redemption and forced acceptance by decree. You couldn't choose your preferred settlement medium anymore. You had to accept what the system defined as money, under its terms, at its value, within its rules. Convenience became compulsion. Move forward again. France, 1719 to 1720. The Mississippi Bubble under John Law. Law convinced the French crown to support paper money issued by his bank, tied to the Mississippi Company. At first, the system created enormous liquidity. Asset prices soared. The public felt richer. Spending accelerated, speculation exploded, then confidence cracked. When people tried to convert notes into metal coin, restrictions appeared. Limits on redemption, delays, controls. Eventually, forced acceptance policies. You could hold money, but your ability to convert or deploy it freely was restricted by decree. This pattern repeats across centuries. When money becomes more abstract and more centralized, behavioral controls follow, slowly at first, then suddenly. Now look at the United States in 1933. Executive Order 610. President Franklin D. Roosevelt prohibited private gold ownership. Citizens were required to turn in gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper dollars. Non-compliance carried heavy fines and prison risk. This wasn't theft in the night, it was policy, legal, public, framed as necessary stabilization. Gold, the escape valve from currency debasement, was closed. People still had money, but their options were narrowed by design. Control doesn't always remove money, it removes alternatives, and alternatives are what preserve freedom. In 1971, another turning point. President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending dollar convertibility into gold for foreign governments. From that moment on, the global monetary system became fully fiat, not backed by metal, backed by policy and confidence alone. Again, not confiscation, redefinition. The structure changed. The rules changed. The nature of money changed, quietly, permanently. Each of these historical moments shares a pattern. The public keeps using money. Transactions continue. Daily life goes on. But the degree of control above the system increases. Programmable money is not just another evolution. It is a control multiplier. Because, for the first time, restrictions don't need to be broad. They can be targeted, not nobody can buy this, but you cannot buy this. Not all accounts are limited, but this account is limited. Modern central bank digital currency pilot programs that are already tested in multiple countries explicitly describe programmable features, spending conditions, expiration dates, merchant restrictions, geographic limits, behavioral incentives. This is not hidden, it is written into design proposals. China's digital yuan pilot has included expiration features to encourage spending velocity, meaning if you don't use the money by a deadline, it disappears. That's not theory, that's documented pilot behavior. In other CBDC research papers and central bank publications, programmable features are described as policy tools, stimulus money that can only be spent on approved goods within approved timeframes at approved vendors. Supporters call this efficiency. But from a control perspective, it changes the nature of money itself. For thousands of years, once money reached your hand, choice began. You decided how to use it, when to use it, whether to save it, whether to exchange it, whether to move it. Programmable money flips that relationship. Now permission travels with the money. And history shows that whenever permission becomes embedded in money, power concentrates. And individual autonomy contracts. This is not about left or right, not about party, not about country. It is about system design. Systems always expand their control capacity when technology allows it. Always, without exception. From taxation systems, to surveillance systems, to identity systems, when finer control becomes possible, it becomes used. Not always abusively at first, but always increasingly over time. The most dangerous control systems in history did not begin as oppression tools. They began as efficiency tools. That is the pattern you should never ignore. Most people assume control arrives as a restriction first, but historically, control almost always arrives as a benefit first. It arrives as convenience, as modernization, as safety, as fraud prevention, as efficiency, as inclusion, as progress. Then, once adoption is universal, the rule layer turns on. You can see this pattern clearly if you study how financial control systems expanded in the 20th and 21st century. Take banking surveillance laws. In the United States, the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 was introduced to fight organized crime and money laundering. On paper, it sounded narrow and reasonable. Banks were required to report large cash transactions and suspicious activity. The public accepted it because the target was criminals. But over time, reporting thresholds stayed the same while inflation rose. Today, a $10,000 transaction still triggers reporting, even though $10,000 today is worth a fraction of what it was in 1970. What was once a large criminal signal became a normal citizen signal. The surveillance net widened, not by dramatic expansion, but by silent drift. Then came the Patriot Act in 2001, again introduced for security. It dramatically expanded financial monitoring powers. Banks were required to implement deeper identity verification, transaction monitoring, and cross-border reporting. Once again, the justification was safety. The result was permanent infrastructure expansion. Infrastructure rarely shrinks after emergencies. It stabilizes and becomes normal. Now layer technology on top of this pattern. In the past, enforcement required people, investigators, auditors, police, court orders. That created friction and delay. Control capacity was limited by manpower. Programmable money removes that friction. Restrictions can execute automatically. No investigator required. No delay required. No appeal window required in real time. If a rule is coded, the rule executes. To understand how powerful that is, look at what happened during financial crisis events when governments needed rapid control. In 2013, Cyprus faced a banking collapse. Depositors woke up to find their bank accounts frozen. Withdrawals were restricted, transfers blocked. Then came the bail-in. Large depositors had a portion of their balances forcibly converted into bank equity to recapitalize the banks. People didn't lose access because they committed crimes. They lost access because the system needed liquidity. Now imagine that same scenario with fully programmable central bank money instead of bank deposits. Controls could be instant, granular, and universal, not just bank level, but currency level. Or look at Greece in 2015. During the sovereign debt crisis, capital controls were imposed, ATM withdrawals were limited, international transfers restricted. Businesses could not pay foreign suppliers without approval, tourism suffered, trade slowed. Citizens stood in lines at cash machines not knowing if access would continue the next day. Cash, physical notes, acted as a pressure release valve. People who held paper currency could still transact locally. In a fully cashless programmable system, that escape valve disappears, no notes. No offline alternative, no parallel settlement path. Control becomes total not because of force, but because of architecture. Supporters of programmable money argue that rules would only apply to criminals, sanctioned actors, or fraud cases. But history shows that rule scope expands under stress. During wartime economies, governments have repeatedly controlled prices, wages, production, and transactions. In the United States, during World War II, ration coupons determined what citizens could buy and how much. Fuel, food, rubber, sugar, all controlled by rule. Now imagine ration logic embedded directly into digital money. The technology makes it trivial. Money that only works for fuel. Money that cannot buy alcohol. Money that expires if not spent. Money that cannot leave a region. Money that cannot be donated to disapproved causes. Not because someone stopped you at a checkpoint, but because the transaction simply fails. We already see early fragments of this logic in modern financial systems. Payment processors today already block categories of purchases based on merchant codes. Certain transactions trigger automatic denial. Certain industries are de-risked by banks, meaning accounts are closed not for crimes proven, but for risk classification. In Canada, in 2022, during the trucker protest convoy, financial institutions froze accounts associated with protest support networks after government emergency powers were invoked. Donations processed through financial platforms were blocked. Access was restricted through the banking layer, not criminal conviction, but administrative action. Regardless of political opinion about the event, the mechanism matters. Financial access became a compliance lever. Programmable money makes that lever faster and more precise. And once a system can apply precision controls, it will, because systems optimize for enforceability. Another historical lesson comes from currency boards and exchange controls. After World War II, many countries imposed strict foreign exchange controls. Citizens could not freely convert local currency into foreign currency. Travel allowances were limited. Cross-border payments required approval. In some countries, holding foreign currency was illegal. Again, money existed, but choice did not. These systems were justified as economic stabilization tools, and often they were introduced as temporary measures. Many lasted decades. Temporary powers have a long history of becoming permanent infrastructure. Now combine three forces: digital identity systems, centralized digital currency, programmable transaction rules. Together, they form something humanity has never previously had: a unified financial behavior control grid. Not a theory, a capability. The argument is always the same. If you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear. History says that is the most dangerous sentence citizens can accept, because definitions of wrong change faster than systems do. In every century, behaviors once legal later became illegal, and vice versa. Speech, trade, ownership, currency use, all have shifted repeatedly across regimes. When money itself becomes rule-bound, flexibility disappears, and flexibility is the foundation of personal economic survival during systemic stress. In every historical collapse, from Weimar Germany to Argentina to Zimbabwe, those who survived best were those who could step outside the failing system, using alternative stores of value, alternative settlement methods, alternative networks. Programmable money aims to close the alternative channels. Not loudly, not violently, but structurally. Every generation believes that its control systems will be used carefully, that this time will be different, that modern institutions are more ethical, more transparent, more accountable than those in the past. History does not support that confidence. Control systems are never built for abuse, they are built for efficiency. Abuse emerges later, under pressure, during crisis, when exceptions become policy. And every major financial control expansion in history has followed the same three-step sequence. First, a crisis appears, real or perceived. Second, a temporary control mechanism is introduced to stabilize the system. Third, the mechanism remains long after the crisis is gone. Emergency powers become standing powers. Temporary controls become permanent architecture. After the Great Depression, financial regulations expanded dramatically across the Western world. Many were justified and necessary, but they also permanently increased the state's role inside banking, currency, and capital flows. The system never returned to its pre-crisis freedom level. After the 2008 global financial crisis, central banks introduced extraordinary monetary tools: zero interest rates, quantitative easing, massive balance sheet expansion. These were described as emergency measures. More than a decade later, they are still embedded in policy frameworks. Markets are now structurally dependent on them. Dependence is the hidden partner of control. Once a population depends on a system, resistance becomes self-harm. That is why the most effective control systems are not imposed. They are adopted, voluntarily, gradually, conveniently. People adopt the system because it works better. At first, digital payments are faster than cash. Online banking is easier than branches. Mobile wallets are simpler than cards. Automatic compliance is easier than personal responsibility. Each step reduces friction. Each step increases reliance. Each step removes one more independent fallback. Independence rarely disappears all at once. It erodes through upgrades. Think about how behavior has already changed. A few decades ago, losing access to one bank account was an inconvenience. Today, losing digital financial access can shut down your entire life. Income, bills, transport, communication, identity verification, subscriptions, work platforms, everything ties back to financial rails. That level of integration creates systemic leverage, and leverage invites rule expansion. Supporters of programmable money say safeguards will exist. Oversight committees, legal protections, use limitations. But every historical safeguard has weakened under sufficient political or economic stress. In 1914, many countries suspended gold convertibility temporarily to finance World War I. Some did not restore it for decades. In 1933, gold ownership bans were justified as stabilization. In multiple countries during currency crises, withdrawal limits were introduced as short-term measures and extended repeatedly. Safeguards are strongest before crisis and weakest during it. That is exactly when programmable control features would be most tempting to use. Imagine a future recession where the government wants to stimulate spending. Instead of sending checks people might save, it sends programmable money that must be spent within 90 days, or expires. Economists would call this efficient stimulus targeting. Technically, they would be correct. But notice what changed. Saving, once a personal right, becomes disallowed by code. Or imagine environmental policy tied directly to currency rules. Spending limits on fuel purchases, transaction penalties for high emission goods, automatic enforcement through payment rails instead of laws enforced after the fact. Again, efficient, logical, technically elegant, and behaviorally controlling. The more programmable the money, the more political the rules become, because code executes policy automatically. Throughout history, the people who navigated systemic transitions best were not the ones who predicted exact policies, but the ones who recognized structural direction early. When money becomes more centralized, control increases. When money becomes more digital, oversight increases. When money becomes programmable, permission increases. That trajectory is consistent across centuries of monetary evolution. This does not mean collapse is guaranteed. It does not mean dystopia is inevitable. It means the structure of power shifts, and those shifts always produce winners and losers. The winners are those who understand system mechanics early. The losers are those who assume mechanics never change. Financial history is not a straight line. It is a series of control expansions, followed by adaptation phases. Those who study the pattern adapt faster than those who ignore it. If you've watched this far, you are clearly not looking for surface-level headlines. You're looking for the deeper system patterns that shape outcomes before they show up in the news. That's exactly what this channel is built to map, calmly, historically, and clearly, so you can see structural shifts before they're obvious. If you want more of that, subscribe. Not for fear, but for understanding. Because in every era of monetary change, awareness is the one advantage that compounds.